Have you ever heard your grandfather criticizing your generation, thinking theirs was better? Considering their generation produced 2 world wars, spiraled global warming out of control, and achieved overpopulation, I could put an asterisk or 2 on his claim. However, when it comes to rich people, one can hardly argue that the past generations of ultra-wealthy lived far more opulently than multi-billionaires today. Moreover, they were far richer. As compared to Chingis Khan's 100+ trillion, Musk is like a Tashkent street rat begging for some food. Yes, people back in the day were far richer, and since there were far too many of them to put in just one video, here is part 2 of the richest people in history. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was widely known as an illiterate brute with a short temper. Yet, despite this lovely tag that people gave him, Cornelius was among the most prominent business people of all time. Some even call him America's first tycoon. His brutish nature, however, had its explanation. Cornelius came from literally nothing, as his family came to America as servants. Thus, all Vanderbilt managed to achieve, he did with his own 2 hands. With hard labor and a keen eye for investment, he dropped out of school at age 11 to work full-time at his father's farm, and when he became 16, he opened his own ferry business between Staten Island and Manhattan. You can imagine how well received a person who literally couldn't write was by the elite. This is the one thing Vanderbilt never got through. His lack of education always stood right there at the edge of his pride, reminding him of the sacrifice he had to make to become the wealthiest person in the world at that time. So kids, if you're wondering why you should stay in school, well, you need an education to be accepted by the elite. Or do you? Still, you'd be far better received if you have a personal fortune of $185 billion. Even more so if you are a railroad monopolist and personally control all the Hudson River traffic when New York was becoming the world's largest commercial hub. Naturally, to get to the equivalent of $185 billion of today's money in the late 19th century, one can easily determine that Vanderbilt was not the most pleasant person to do business with. He often indulges in speculation and some borderline illegal activities. Thus, he earned the nickname the Robber Baron. Despite his shortcomings, Cornelius Vanderbilt was, before all else, a builder. He'd be remembered for constructing the Grand Central Depot in New York and sponsoring the Central University in Nashville with more than $1 million, equal to more than $70 million in today's money. By the end of his life, Cornelius owned land worth more than $100 million at the time, making him the richest man in the world. For quite some time, he was considered the wealthiest man in history, though later estimates will show he was only the 15th richest man in history. Muammar Gaddafi. Living life to the fullest, outside of the law, and always looking as coked up as a gallon of soda mixed with a bag of Mentos. While this description might fit any old rock superstar, I'm actually talking of a world leader. Well, he was a world leader before his gruesome demise after the Arab Spring and the subsequent Libyan civil war. Of course, I'm talking about Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator who managed to spark so much infamy around the world, ruled over the North African country for more than 42 years with an iron fist. His first order of business was to infuse the country's massive oil reserves into his personal possessions, which skyrocketed his net worth to more than $200 billion. Oil was not the only source of his vast fortune, as he was linked to the slave trade, drug trade, and terrorism, so he was not the best person for you to look up to. Naturally, the charismatic Libyan leader knew how to spend money in style. He thought of himself as a fashion icon, and often changed clothes even several times a day. Well, may have been a fashion icon when he was young, but by the 1990s, he looked more like an AliExpress Lenny Kravitz. Still, all of his clothes were made out of silk cashmere and golden threads. His wardrobe cost more than several $1 million alone. However, that pales compared to his personal tent, with which he always traveled abroad. While you might think he just enjoyed camping, the point of bringing his own place to stay was security. The tent was bulletproof and Gaddafi couldn't trust hotels to ensure his safety, not with the CIA, MI6, and SAS after him. Moreover, the Mad Dog of the East, as Gaddafi was known in the West, had 3 lavish houses, all richly decorated with silk, gold, and silver. The Libyan leader also had 3 private jets, worth nearly $200 million, dozens of cars, and jewelry in abundance. However, what really surprised the world was when he hired Beyoncé for a private party. Queen Bey shared the stage with Mariah Carey, Lionel Richie, and Usher. I wonder if Gaddafi used Mariah's All I Want for Christmas as interrogation torture. Henry Ford. Henry Ford was not all bad. No, really. Despite his anti-Jewish semantics and having a certain German dictator famous for his hatred towards Jewish people as a fanboy, Henry Ford was a genius entrepreneur who single-handedly pushed the American economy into its golden age. How did he do that? The tycoon championed the idea of a 5-day, 40-hour work week. Naturally, he didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart. Many still debate whether he actually had a heart, or whether he had installed a Model T engine inside his chest instead. No, Ford stood behind the workers' demands for 2 major reasons. 1, to cease any notions of socialism in America, and 2nd, to get filthy rich. How would he do that? By selling cars to his workers, of course. If people had no free time, why would they need a car? Why would they need anything, actually? By giving them a whole new free day, Ford managed to open an entirely new market for his cars. And his plan succeeded. By the time he passed away, Henry Ford had nearly $250 billion. Along with his many factories and investments, Ford didn't forget to live a little. He bought a 55-room mansion and 1,400 acres of land. At the time, the estate alone cost more than $3 million, which is more than $76 million in today's money. Another one of his properties has recently come onto the market at a price of $175 million. Naturally, the American manufacturer had dozens of cars, watches, and everything modern billionaires would have. I wonder if Ford was the original billionaire stereotype. Andrew Carnegie. If 2 mega mansions in the heart of Manhattan don't scream filthy rich, then I simply can't figure out how to introduce Andrew Carnegie. The steel tycoon definitely knew how to live large, and his $372 billion indeed helped a lot, as there were rarely any expensive commodities other than estates and textiles during his time. Carnegie had to oblige with the era and bought some pretty lavish houses that were borderline palaces and decorated them opulently. His first house was the gorgeous Carnegie Mansion, which can still be seen on Fifth Avenue today. It was one of the first houses worldwide to have a steel frame, central heating, and a private elevator. Having an elevator at this time was much like having a space shuttle today. The second house was adjacent to the first, though much smaller. It was built for Carnegie's daughter. Being half Scottish, Carnegie had always been drawn to his country of origin. So, what would you do if you had all the money in the world and wanted a place in your old country? Buy a castle? Exactly. Carnegie spared no expense in purchasing a lavish, historically significant, genuine castle in Scotland. He paid the colossal sum of £3 million, which in today's money is roughly £500 million or $600 million for this cultural landmark and the surrounding area. This, however, is only the beginning. According to some records, he spent roughly another £1 billion in today's money on renovations. In addition, he added some unseen features at the time, like a private indoor swimming pavilion and a private golf course. You might think this is not a big deal, but at the turn of the 20th century, having an indoor swimming pool and a private golf course was like having a private Olympic stadium and hosting the Olympic Games on your own. Knowing how much the last few Olympics cost, Carnegie indeed could have afforded to host the events. Unlike most people you'll find in this list and those in part 1, Carnegie was a pretty good person who genuinely enjoyed giving back to society. That's not something you often see in multi-billionaires from the beginning of the 20th century. The Scottish-American steel tycoon, however, made a name for himself as one of the biggest philanthropists of all time. By the end of his life, he had donated more than 90% of his wealth to various charities. Now that's what I call a power move. Donating more than $350 billion and still being the richest man alive. Jakob Fugger. 1459 was a particularly good year. Not that any year in the 15th century was all that good, but there were no major plague outbreaks, just a few minor wars in Europe, and more notably the War of the Roses in Great Britain. But all in all, it was a great year. What made it even better was the birth of Jakob Fugger, who would later become the wealthiest man in the world and one of the most influential people in the entire history of Europe. Jakob was fortunate enough to have a great start in life. Unlike most people during that time, he began his first business when he was only 12. Much like me, though mine didn't bring me 400 billion in the long run, yet. Yes, the prominent German banker, entrepreneur, and merchant managed to acquire nearly $500 billion, and while he did live splendidly, he mostly used his money to gain political power. Fugger was so productive at his younger age that estimates suggest he was responsible for 2% of Europe's entire GDP at the time. Now that's what I call a hard-working man. His wealth only complemented his brilliance. He masked his desire to have some influence in the church with charity. Fugger spent millions on building cathedrals, monasteries, chapels, and churches. And we all know how modest and uncorrupt the church is. Was. So, when the Pope appointed Carlo I, who later was crowned as Charles V, to be the Holy Roman Emperor, it was no surprise that Fugger stood behind his candidacy. Guess if the low-born German gained nobility afterward. Moreover, he managed to convince the Pope to allow interest on loans. To this point, loaning money was entirely the game of Jews, as the Catholic faith considered it a sin to give money in exchange for a profit. So what would a banker do, except spend a few million on building up several dozen churches, and then convincing the Pope to allow interest on loans? Afterward, Fugger financed the Habsburgs and their rise to power. Yes, the same Habsburgs who ruled over Central and Eastern Europe for 3 centuries and were behind the First World War. Outside politics, Jakob was interested in traveling. He financed and joined the first German expedition to India. Moreover, he lived one truly luxurious lifestyle, as far as luxury went in the 15th century. Jakob lived in one magnificent castle in Augsburg, which you can still visit today. No matter how hated he was by everyone else, Fugger was a brilliant man who is widely considered the father of modern banking. And when you produce 2% of Europe's GDP, well, you may deserve to have some power over what's going to happen on the continent. So, what percentage of Europe's GDP did you produce when you were 12? Let me know in the comments below. And if these brilliant entrepreneurs and Muammar Gaddafi were not wealthy enough for you, don't miss out on part 1 of the richest people in history.